The spring of 2025 has seen a dramatic upsurge in political protest across Central and Eastern Europe. Demonstrations have erupted in Serbia, Hungary, and Romania, reflecting deep-seated discontent with incumbent governments and their policies. These protests, while triggered by specific local events, also tap into broader anxieties about corruption, authoritarianism, and the erosion of democratic norms. The scale of the protests has taken many by surprise. In Serbia, hundreds of thousands have taken to the streets of Belgrade, marking the largest demonstrations since the fall of Slobodan Milosevic in 2000. Similarly, in Hungary, tens of thousands have rallied against the long rule of Prime Minister Viktor Orban, challenging his increasingly authoritarian grip on power. These events have sent shockwaves through the region and beyond, raising questions about the stability of these countries and their future direction. The protesters' demands vary, but common themes include calls for greater transparency, accountability, and an end to endemic corruption. They are also demanding a fairer society with equal opportunities for all. The governments in Serbia and Hungary have responded to the protests with a mixture of concessions and defiance, but the situation remains highly volatile. It is still too early to say what the long-term impact of these protests will be, but they have undoubtedly shaken the political landscape in Central and Eastern Europe. The immediate trigger for the protests in Serbia was a tragic accident that occurred in November 2024. An awning collapsed at a train station in the city of Novi Sad, killing 15 people and injuring many more. The incident sparked outrage across the country, with many blaming the government for neglecting safety regulations and failing to hold those responsible to account. The Novi Sad tragedy quickly became a symbol of wider public anger with the rule of President Aleksandar Vučić, who has been in power for over a decade. Vučić, a former ultra-nationalist turned pro-European reformer, has been accused of presiding over a system rife with corruption and cronyism. Critics argue that his government has prioritized loyalty over competence, leading to a decline in public services and a culture of impunity for those close to the regime. The protesters in Serbia are demanding a thorough investigation into the Novi Sad train station collapse and the prosecution of those responsible, regardless of their political connections. They are also calling for Vučić's resignation, arguing that he has lost the moral authority to govern. The Serbian government initially responded to the protests with a mix of concessions and repression. The prime minister resigned, and Vučić promised a crackdown on corruption. However, he has also accused the protesters of being manipulated by foreign powers and has deployed riot police to disperse demonstrations, leading to clashes and arrests. The situation in Serbia remains tense, with the potential for further unrest. In Hungary, the protests have been fueled by growing discontent with the increasingly authoritarian rule of Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Orban, who has been in power since 2010, has gradually consolidated his grip on the country's institutions, curtailing press freedom, undermining the independence of the judiciary, and targeting civil society organizations. His Fidesz party has rewritten the constitution, electoral laws, and the education system, entrenching its power and making it increasingly difficult for the opposition to challenge its dominance. Orban's government has been accused of widespread corruption, with allegations that public funds have been siphoned off to enrich a small circle of oligarchs close to the ruling party. This has led to accusations that Orban is turning Hungary into an illiberal democracy, where elections are held but democratic norms are hollowed out. The protests in Hungary have been spearheaded by a diverse coalition of opposition parties, civil society groups, and ordinary citizens who are fed up with Orban's rule. They are demanding free and fair elections, an end to corruption, and a restoration of democratic freedoms. Orban has responded to the protests with defiance, accusing the protesters of being part of a foreign-funded conspiracy to undermine Hungary's sovereignty. GAP3S. Meanwhile, in Romania, a wave of protests has surged through the streets, echoing the discontent seen in Serbia and Hungary. The catalyst for these demonstrations has been the government's controversial judicial reforms and widespread corruption scandals. Romanians have long been frustrated with their political leaders. but recent events have brought their anger to a boiling point. The protests began in earnest when the government attempted to pass emergency decrees that would decriminalize certain corruption offenses and weaken the independence of the judiciary. This move was seen by many as an attempt to protect corrupt politicians and businessmen from prosecution. The streets of Bucharest and other major cities filled with tens of thousands of protesters, waving flags and chanting slogans demanding justice and accountability. The Romanian government, led by the Social Democratic Party, PSD, has been accused of undermining democratic institutions and eroding the rule of law. Despite facing pressure from both domestic and international actors, the government has shown little willingness to back down. Instead, they have tried to paint the protesters as being influenced by foreign interests, a narrative similar to what has been seen in Hungary. Public sentiment in Romania is a mix of frustration and hope. The frustration stems from years of perceived governmental corruption and the slow pace of reform. However, there is also hope, as the large-scale protests demonstrate a strong civic engagement and a desire for a more transparent and accountable government. The future of Romania's political landscape remains uncertain. The protests have forced the government to reconsider some of its more controversial measures, but the underlying issues of corruption and lack of judicial independence remain unresolved. The resilience and determination of the Romanian people will be crucial in shaping the outcome of this ongoing struggle for integrity and democracy. The protests in Serbia and Hungary have drawn international attention, with Western governments expressing concern about the erosion of democratic norms in both countries. The European Union, of which both Serbia and Hungary are members, has been particularly critical of Orban's government, launching several infringement procedures against Hungary for violating EU law. However, the EU's leverage over both countries is limited. Russia, on the other hand, has been accused of meddling in the internal affairs of both Serbia and Hungary, using its influence to stir up nationalist sentiment and undermine pro-Western governments. The protests in Serbia and Hungary represent a significant challenge to the established order in both countries. They reflect deep-seated public discontent with corruption, inequality, and the erosion of democratic values. The outcome of these protests remains uncertain. However, they serve as a stark reminder that the transition to democracy in Central and Eastern Europe is far from complete, and that the gains made over the past 3 decades cannot be taken for granted. For more challenging perspectives on the latest in global news, scientific discoveries, and controversial social issues, subscribe to our channel. Just like everyone else on here always says.